I'm Katie. I started in the full-service sex industry
My name is
at a
Alex
brothel.
Andrews. I am the executive
My
program
name's
director for
Wotton.
SWAT Behind Bars.
I've been a sex worker
I'm
for
Annie
over
Temple.
30 years.
I've been really interested in like the different experiences that a lot of like different people have.
There is a level of
So that's
protection.
kind of where this
So I think the
project came into being.
Hello, and welcome back to the final episode in this series of Illuminated in Red Light, the podcast that with the myths and misconceptions about the sex industry through discussions with real sex workers from around the world. My name is Emma, and I'm going to be the hopefully not too annoying voice in your ear in between some of the most interesting conversations with some of the most fascinating people that you have ever met. Sex work is one of the world's oldest occupations, and it's also one of the most beautiful and diverse industries in the world. And yet at the same time, it is one of the most misunderstood. In fact, I would bet that some people have already turned off this podcast at the mere mention of the industry. A couple of years ago, I might have as well. I used to buy into the idea that sex work happened on those dark street corners of Hollywood films, where scantily clad bodies and drugs and alcohol, crime, and even death were prolific, sinful depictions that were illuminated in red light for the underbelly of the world. That image of the industry is probably not very different to what a large portion of the population thinks as well. I theorize that this is because a lot of people, and a couple of years ago, myself included, have never stopped to listen to the people who actually buy and sell sex. I passed a judgment based on what the media and centuries of misinformation had taught me. And honestly, I wasn't necessarily to blame, and neither would you be. There's a reason that these stereotypes are so prolific. This podcast aims to shed light on the stories and voices of real people from the sex industry from around the world, in an effort to rewrite some of the false narratives that have overshadowed the red light industry for centuries. One of the core investigations of this podcast was to uncover and listen to the narratives of sex workers from around the world. So far, we have heard some beautiful discussions about the benefits of the sex industry for workers and clients who partake in it. We have also heard about some of the shortcomings that things like legislation and stigma can bring to the industry, but how some of the amazing people working for the industry have persevered despite those hassles. At the same time, the incredible people I've interviewed have told us how they have dedicated themselves to making the industry more accessible, understood, and safer for their fellow sex workers. In this episode of Illuminated in Red Light, I want to bring together all of their stories and learn about how these wonderful people navigate and celebrate their lives, and in some cases, tolerate the systems that they live in that seem determined to bring them down. Today's conversations are going to range from the day-to-day stigma that remains prevalent in different countries to the racism that plays a major role in the legislation and violence towards sex workers. You may remember from the previous episodes conversations that I have been having with Katie. When I spoke to Katie for the first time in almost 7 years, I found myself to be so delighted and uplifted by her presence. For all those who need a reminder, Katie is a full-service sex worker living in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Living in a decriminalized country like Aotearoa, when I asked her about what she perceived to be any barriers to safety in the industry, I'll admit I wasn't necessarily expecting an answer. I've never worked in Aotearoa, but I absolutely went into this interview with my rose-tinted glasses on. After living in the United States for so long, I had fallen into the trap of picturing everybody in decriminalized countries living in a relative paradise, unbothered by concerns about their safety and people like the police. The city I grew up in had brothels and strip clubs up and down the main drag, and I grew up fairly acclimatized to the concept of sex. However, speaking to Katie brought me back down to reality.
Do you know what I think especially under the current government, I am in such a position of privilege where the things I have to think about, lots of people don't have to think about. Like, I see lots of news around whorephobic banks and things like that. And I'm so lucky that I have always been with Kiwibank. They don't really care. They don't really pay attention where my money's coming from. But if they do catch me and go, hello, are you a sex worker? They're not going to stop my home loan or my like my cards or my bank account. It's more about the social climate for me that feels unsafe.
Of course.
I think more in terms of unsafety, I, as a white presenting person, I don't have a problem going with police. So I'm super aware of my privilege. That means that I worry about things that other people don't worry about. Like, what happens when I want to buy the next house? How am I going to explain my income to banks that don't want my business? I feel safe disclosing to the people whose job it is to keep me safe, which is like the police or, things like that. The harm is more like, I don't know, systemic that I'm worried about than anything else.
Her concerns about banking hark back to the previous episode, where we unpacked some of the common and alarming misconceptions about sex trafficking and its non-relationship to sex work. Having banks be concerned about the flow of money from sex workers in case it's linked to human trafficking is an incredibly outdated but prolific piece of stigma. To hear more about that, I encourage you to listen to the previous episode of this podcast if you haven't already. Katie's experience of bank discrimination is not uncommon. The New York Times ran an article entitled "Sex Workers Have Been Shunned by Banks Even When Their Work is Legal" in 2023. The article detailed the consistent closure of sex worker-owned bank accounts, even in Nevada, the only state in the United States where sex work is legalized. Many sex workers, including a 4-decade veteran of the industry, had been denied mortgages, saving plans, and loans. The same sex worker had her employees, also sex workers, wait for up to 2 weeks to have their paychecks cleared. Maintaining bank accounts is often essential for applying to apartments or other housing, signing up for insurance, or accessing any other basic government assistance. Again, I wonder if a country that is so focused on, quote, protecting their citizens, why do they make it so difficult for people to access the care that is supposed to help them? The difficulty in accessing bank accounts was attributed to the proposed risk that banks could take on by accepting what could be illegal income. However, the article accurately predicted that this was an issue that was not just limited to criminalized countries. Quote, "Even if the trade were decriminalized," some banking insiders say, their biggest concern would continue to be letting a serious crime fall through the cracks, particularly human trafficking, which can cost them millions of dollars in fines. If a person's repeated stream of cash deposits sets off an alarm bell, banks may also consider a sexually suggestive social media or public profile, for example, in combination with too many transactions from websites that the bank deems to be high risk. End quote. Even in Aotearoa, it can be difficult to manage the deep-rooted stigma associated with sex work and the misinformation that has been prolific for centuries. Once again, as the article states, enabling stigma and misconceptions to rule institutions doesn't lead to increased safety for sex workers, but could lead people to invest in other things like cryptocurrency or to store cash in their homes or with a third party, opening themselves up to instability and potentially being targeted by exploiters. This type of stigma is not specific just to banks, however. Annie, a sex worker in Canada who is also an author and a podcaster, spoke about her difficulty when publishing one of her many books on the platform like Amazon.
There's also a chapter on like how to avoid censorship, which is really, really freaking hard because even though I wrote that chapter in that book, my next book after that was completely censored because of the title. So my memoir was called How Sex Work Shaped My Life. And I thought that's a sexy title. And I see titles of books everywhere. Whore of New York, like and memoirs with the whore, sex worker, call girl, porn star. And I thought I need to have sex work in my title. Wrong, bad, big mistake. Amazon basically banned my book. Like, no, there were so many places in the United States that people couldn't even purchase it. It wouldn't even show up. They shadow banned it. So no matter where you are in the world, if you write it in How Sex Work Shaped My Life in the title, it doesn't come up or show. The only way to find it on Amazon was to look up my name, go to my author page, and then look to see what my books were. So I ended up renaming it to Healing in Stilettos, and it worked. It's not banned anymore. So like, even though I wrote a book and even a chapter on how to avoid censorship, I still got caught up in the censorship stuff. So and that's a big reason. Well, the biggest impetus for me to start writing under my real name was all the censorship I was experiencing.
Simply having the title sex work on a book was enough for Annie to struggle to get her book published. only after she changed the title that she was able to see her book come up in public forums. This is the same problem that a lot of different people face, especially when trying to discuss sex work. Discussing sex work can often feel like you're talking to a brick wall. People immediately shut off, unwilling to listen, and often embarrassed that you've brought it up in the first place. The term sex work comes with such an array of stigma now that it is difficult to get through to people and to have them accept you for who you are. I want to go back to something that Katie said when she was discussing the difficulty that she had with banks. In that snippet, Katie also discussed how she is privileged for being white presenting, which gives her an advantage when going to the police. Something that we haven't discussed as much in this podcast is about how much more difficult and dangerous it can be to work as a sex worker if you're a person of color. People of color, especially trans or cis women of color, are disproportionately targeted by violence and stigma in the sex industry. Criminalization in particular only exacerbates the violence and prejudice that people of color face on a daily basis, as it allows law enforcement to use their ingrained racism to target individuals in the industry based on their ethnicity. Data collected by the organization Decriminalizing Sex Work, often just referred to as DSW, found that of sex workers who were identified by the police between 2008 and 2018 in New York City, 55% of Black women were convicted on charges versus only 8% of white women. 28% of Hispanic sex workers were convicted, and 4% of multiracial sex workers were convicted as well. 38.2% of Black individuals were convicted of purchasing sex, compared to a 9.8% of white customers. 37.6% and 14.4% of Hispanic and multiracial customers were convicted of purchasing sex, respectively. The vulnerability that criminalized sex workers face in the industry, in particular the increased susceptibility to abuse, is magnified for cis and trans women of color who are already disproportionately affected by crime. One needs only to look at the Gilgo Beach serial killer, who assaulted and murdered a huge number of Black sex workers whose crimes went uninvestigated and undiscovered for years, largely because the police were not interested in investigating the disappearance of Black and brown sex workers, or Black and brown women in general. When I was testifying for a bill to grant immunity to sex workers in 2024, I was also testifying against a proposed bill that would grant immunity to all sex workers except those who were arrested for massaging without a license. The exclusion of this clause would leave the majority of people who were arrested in Rhode Island, Asian women working in massage parlors, without access to the immunity that was being offered to a largely whiter portion of the sex industry. Racism against sex workers of color proliferates not only law enforcement, but also the legislation meant to uphold the so-called safety of people in the industry. It is also racism that permeates the infantilization of legislation targeting migrant sex workers. Annie, who is an Indigenous sex worker in Canada, also discussed the prolific violence against people of color in the sex industry and the mistrust of the police. The missing and murdered inquiry that she mentions in this snippet is referring to the missing and murdered Indigenous women movement.
You know, if they really had a vendetta against me. In British Columbia specifically, we, for the last maybe, 15 years, have not had a lot of enforcement around sex work. A lot of the other provinces have, and we haven't. And that's because we had missing and murdered women inquiry that happened about 15 years ago. And they were sex workers from the poorest neighborhood in Canada, the downtown east side of Vancouver. And that inquiry led to some law changes because obviously what usually happens is when sex workers go missing, police don't do anything. And they determined through this inquiry that the laws were having a worse effect on obviously violence towards sex workers, which we all know, and it makes complete, total normal sense because it's common sense. Push something underground, people are not going to be able to get help. But yeah, anyway, so in BC, because of sex workers being a part of that process, and the families of the victims and the police being like really called out, they changed their policy around sex work, that they would only investigate complaints towards like complaints about violence or exploitation, basically. So for over 10 years, we didn't have a single murder of a sex worker in BC, which is insane. I mean, sex workers, I'm sure, died of overdoses and maybe even murdered under circumstances of not doing sex work. You know what I mean? But not sex workers getting killed in the line of duty, you know? And that was because of the enforcement. But more recent years, police have started to forget about that shit. New fucking guys are coming on and they're not getting educated. And now we're starting to hear about more police exploitation towards sex workers happening. Obviously, the people who are on the street are getting the brunt of anything that's happening with the police, and I cannot speak for what's happening with them. I really can't. They probably would tell a different story.
Returning to a moment to Katie and Aotearoa, I wanted to briefly bring up a study that I read about Maori and Pacifica sex workers in Aotearoa. For those who don't know, Maori people are the Indigenous people of Aotearoa. This study comes courtesy of the NZPC. The report read that, quote, Maori sex workers recognize the gains of a decriminalized environment. Few workers report coercion, with just 4% of the 772 sex workers in a 2008 study stating that they were made to work. 8% of street-based sex workers, 3% of managed brothel workers, and 4% of indoor private workers. End quote. It also shared a story from a Maori sex worker at the time, Pania, which I found to be very interesting. Quote, I'm an Indigenous Maori sex worker in New Zealand. I've worked for 6 years in brothels and for myself with other friends who are also sex workers from a shared apartment. It's much easier to have the choices of places to work. I like that I can choose where I can work and I don't have to hide away somewhere dodgy to avoid the cops. I'm also not on any database held by the cops about sex work. Decriminalization means that I can choose to turn down clients I don't want to see for any reason, and my boss can't pressure me. I don't have to worry about a client that may be an undercover cop, so I can be upfront with what our expectations are, such as using condoms. My clients know that they have to behave or they can get in trouble because I will call the cops and they will come and help me. I also really like that my clients aren't scared of being raided, so things are more relaxed and easier to manage. I've had clients who have come from countries where it's illegal to be a client, and they have been on edge, scared, and difficult to manage. I like that I can talk with other sex workers and share information and stories with them. End quote. Supporting sex workers means supporting movements like missing and murdered Indigenous women, Black Lives Matter, and standing against racism in all forms. It also means supporting trans people, especially trans people of color in the industry, who also face an unprecedented level of violence. Bella Robinson briefly discussed Coyote, Rhode Island's relation to this in our interview.
Okay, my sister was intersex and she died in June. And none of these people want to stand up for sex workers, even though they won their fucking rights off our backs. Okay. And I remember going to the school board meeting and testifying and telling them about my sister, which bathroom would you made her use. And I got to call the people Christian fascists, which is always a good day because it's like saying fuck you in public and they can't say the Christian fascists. And I keep telling them they're coming after you next. They're coming after you next. And they don't believe it. So Women's Project was really good to us. We were on the steering committee. We passed the EACA, which means that if you were Medicaid or state workers could access abortion through the healthcare. And the next year they said, well, we're going to do trans. Why couldn't they do sex workers too? Now we found out, listen to this, only 1% of cis women are sex workers, but 10% of trans women are sex workers. Because at one point I heard 80%, but that sounded more realistic. You know what I'm saying? And one of our people from our support group is a trans man sex worker who Rhode Island has this conference once a year that I just found out about it. I think Ryan through Thundermist told us about it. At first I was there was a provider track and a community track. And I was going to do the community track. And I said, is it even okay that I do this because I'm not trans? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
She goes, yeah. But then I said, how would you like me to have a trans man sex worker So I filed a grant to get her travel fee, and we're gonna do it together. But it's like told her, I said, I'm not censoring you. Put everything in there you want, and she's had the same experience. A lot of trans people, they accept the trans part of you, but they don't want to. We have these identities, the they, them, all this stuff, right? But they don't want to accept that part of our identity, right? So I tell these people, I got on the GLAD thing. I was on there. I said the next generation of throwaway youth is going to be like with nothing we've ever seen. Imagine how many these kids in the next generation come, and we're going to have halfway houses run by the community, and and we have to get ready. This is going to happen. And I said, when we did our survey on 1,515 people, only 37% were heterosexual. The majority of sex workers are queer. So when you're glad and you're not advocating for sex workers, you're not even advocating for your own fucking people. Okay. So I explained that, and we were on this listserv, and then I sent our thing out where you can copy and paste and send your letter in, to support our bill within 5 minutes, and not one of them did it. And a couple of weeks later, I went on the listserv. I said, this is really hurtful. I explained this to you, explained it again. You don't have to approve of what we're doing, but do you think it's okay? They're hunting us and they want us to die, and we're being murdered. But and Jocelyn from Women's Project was the only one that emailed me back. She's like, Bella, I'm so sorry, because you were really brave to do that. So now I still support, and this is what I told him too. And even though you won't show up for us, we're still going to show up for you.
In another interview that I conducted with somebody who lives in New South Wales, Australia, where sex work is decriminalized, I asked Dr. Wotton about some of the common misconceptions about her job as a sex worker and as an academic. Now, some of this snippet has already been shared in previous episodes, but I wanted to include it again as Dr. Wotton makes some important points.
So feel free to skip it. But what would you say that you find the most common misconception about the sex industry is, and how does that impact the way that you work, and also the way that you do your academic and sex work advocacy?
There's so many misconceptions. I think age is one thing, and so the age of sex workers. So people are very focused on young sex workers, and the idea that there could be those of us who are more mature. And also, in academia within sex work, there has been quite a bit of research to show that some people enter the industry later. They don't start at 18. I started at 20. Would have started earlier if I'd, had known how. But I think the age and also the gender. So you'll notice with the abolitionists and all the people who are pushing and ramming like the Swedish model down people's throats, it is gender-based. And a lot of us are like, no. Like you'll notice in countries and debates about, we should have the Swedish model, that it's very much focused on criminalising those men who pay those women for sexual services. Really dismissing the fact that sex workers are able to consent. So the framing of it as a young female victim, literally abolitionists have said that there's no such thing as being able to consent, that it's all rape and sexual assault, which is real infantilization of women for a start. But also there's people of all genders who are part of the sex industry, and our clients are not just male as well, they're all genders. So, trans workers, non-binary workers, intersex workers and clients, female clients, and sex workers across the board, and it needs to be non-gendered if you're looking at anything to do with the sex industry, because safety for one is safety for all. But as soon as you go down that path of those men are raping those women, then, the argument should have just been gone. I'm sorry, you're beating your own drum over here, but it's got nothing to do with keeping the people within the industry safe. So I think that's a real problem, massive problem. And also, like I said earlier, people are very fixated on the fact that if you flap money around in front of a sex worker's face, then we just are like their puppets, like that they purchase this. Like you hear a lot about people selling their bodies, and on one hand it's a very serious comment, and the other half we're just always rolling our eyes and laughing, because it's like, well, as far as I'm concerned, when I look down, my body is still with me. I've been a sex worker for over 30 years. I can't sell my body. My body's mine. I sell sexual services for a pre-negotiated amount of time on a certain day for a certain price, and it's very specific services. So it's not that you pay me money and you can do whatever you want to me. That's not how this works. Once again, I can't go to an accountant and say, you need to do all of my accountancy, you need to do my BAS statement, you need to do my personal tax, you need to do my business tax, you need to do all of this, because they'll be like, I only offer personal tax. I don't do all this other tax. You know, you can't go to a GP and say, do cardiac surgery on me. Like, but you have to go to a specialist. You know, you break a leg, you can't go to, you know, you go to A&E, accident and emergency at the hospital. They don't do surgery and put pins in you there. They send you to a specialist who is going to do that surgery. And you have to be assessed, and it has to be pre-negotiated. It's the same with the sex industry. So people lose their minds over this. And I think the other one that people really get their knickers in the twist about is the fact that private workers can work from home. So where I operate in Sydney, I have authorization to work from home without even having to tell council, which is the way it should be. And people get their knickers in the twist for private workers working in residential areas, because what about the children? And I have been saying for 30 years now, I'm sorry, but if anyone has more than one child in their family, then you must assume that they procreated and had sex in the room next door to their eldest child. And I'm assuming they did it more than once, and then they do it for fun, not just for procreation, and their kids are perfectly fine. So how on earth will these kids be able to have x-ray vision walking down the street in a residential area and somehow miraculously knowing that I am offering sexual services behind closed doors? So people have these big misconceptions. Like I've heard it all in council debates about, man, they're going to be lining up outside and people are going to knock on the wrong door and they're going to be pissing on the garden. Like, you know, you just can't believe how stupid some people are, and these ideas that they create. And the whole idea of working from home or working from a quiet, private workspace is that you're working smarter, not harder, and you're choosing, and you're being able to communicate with your clients ahead of time, and you can see less clients. So it's about peer education to support people about how to screen clients and how to negotiate when. But there's no waiting room. It's not like a doctor's surgery or a hairdressing salon. You know, we space people out. We just don't go back to back. So I think that's a big misconception. And even with sex services premises, which is the legal definition in New South Wales for all sex industry premises. So that includes brothels, massage parlours, BDSM parlours, things like that. Having them in commercial zones. So historically they've been upstairs from like fish and chip stores or like hairdressing salons or things like that. Or they're in areas where people do congregate and there is public transport. So a lot of people try to say, oh no, there should be in industrial zones, but actually that's a really unsafe kind of area. So you have to drive there. There's no through traffic. There's, you know, a lot of the places in the industrial areas, you know, they may work during the day. So at night, there's hardly any other people around. So it's kind of like othering, and it's kind of keeping people in the shadows, and it's isolating, instead of it just being another part of the industry, another part of the workforce where people get to come and go. And so a lot of the arguments are like, oh, but you can't have a sex services premises like near a bus stop because there could be children. And once again, it's like, if you just have discreet signage, and advertising where the kids aren't going to know. It's only the adults who are going to tell the children. And once again, it's behind closed doors. It's not like, it's not like in Amsterdam where there's like the windows where people are sitting in the windows and soliciting for work. Behind closed doors, with massage parlors and full service brothels and BDSM parlors, it's by appointment, or if it is by, if you can walk in as well with walk-ins, then you have to ring a doorbell and it's discreet. And then the receptionist is not going to let a child in. And if we err on the side of caution, we'll ask for ID as well. So I think they're the big misconceptions. This whole weird idea that children need to be so far removed from anyone doing anything pleasurable to do with sex. And the other thing that we've dealt with in New South Wales previously is that even with sex shops, they had to be upstairs or downstairs. And you couldn't operate businesses like massage parlors, full service brothels, sex clubs, strip joints on street level or on ground level. You had to somehow have steps. And it's the most ludicrous thing. Children can go up and down steps for a start. So it's really ridiculous. But if we also look at the fact that it's inaccessible. So in terms of the state, the national and the international charters that countries sign off on to support rights for people with disability, then we need to start being able to employ that when approving and supporting different business structures to be able to operate. So having sex industry businesses being able to operate in accessible venues is really important. And going from that, one of the other things that people, the misconceptions is that, along with our clients are just male, which is completely wrong, but that they're all able-bodied, which is really silly, and that they're all young. So our clients are of all ages, and also there's lots of different clients who interact with the sex industry who have a disability. And we know that there is a lot of people with invisible disabilities. So people just see or think about the person with cerebral palsy, generally a man in their 30s in a wheelchair. But my research and my personal and professional experience shows that that's very narrow-minded and myopic. That with a lot of dynamic and invisible disabilities such as PTSD, anxiety, depression, autism spectrum disorder. There's a whole range of different disabilities that you would never know about unless the person told you about it, or they would only present and want to see a sex worker on a good day. So if they're having a high pain day or high anxiety day, then the sex worker wouldn't see them. But I think this idea about who is a client needs to be addressed more, because it does feed straight back into the legislative reforms and the debates that are happening around the world. And going back to the dichotomy between the Swedish model being the absolute worst regulatory legislative system and decriminalization, full decriminalization being the best, we need to talk about the diversity of both the clients, the locations, and also the people who are involved in providing the services.
One of the parts of this discussion that I was especially drawn to was Dr. Wotton's critique of people who perceive the sex industry as damaging to children. As I mentioned earlier, I grew up going to the cinema opposite strip clubs and brothels in Aotearoa, and I just wanted to say that this was one of the least concerning parts of my childhood. In fact, I didn't put together that the establishments were strip clubs until I was well into my teenage years. And embarrassingly, it wasn't until I spoke to somebody who worked at the swim club above the Mermaid strip club that I put together that it was a brothel. The only recollection I have of those clubs from when I was a little kid was giggling at how one of the girls in the picture on their billboard had such a big butt. If I, a loose 8-year-old running wild in the streets of Wellington, was not traumatized by the clear advertisements for sex work, then I sincerely doubt that another child playing hopscotch in the neighborhood is going to be affected by a non-advertised brothel down the street. But this was a misconception that I clashed with while I was in Amsterdam as well. I mentioned here before, but I lived and studied in Amsterdam for several months in 2024. While I was there, one of my professors encouraged the class to go and do an ethnographic study of the red light district, located in the middle of the city. As a side note, I encouraged people to go and research the movement of the red light district from Amsterdam's center to a sex hotel in the finance district. This move was not approved by or consulted with the sex workers of Amsterdam. During the discussion in class afterwards, several fellow American students, although I identify more as a Kiwi, said that they had been concerned by the presence of a daycare in the district and that there were families just walking around the streets. For those who don't know, the red light district is not just an area with lots of windows and brothels, it is also a residential area where families live, and it is home to a host of other businesses that capitalize on the tourism in the area. The daycare that they mentioned is one that I passed often while I was in the area, located on a side street next to a church. I was personally aggravated and confused by this criticism. By using critical thinking, it made sense for a residential area to have a daycare for children, and if the families walking around were unfazed by the presence of the industry, it boggled my mind as to why these abject strangers would be this concerned. It reminded me of the reasoning that the city of Amsterdam gave to not making working from home for sex workers license-free. I read out that letter and its mind-numbing formality on the first episode in this series, and you might recall that one of the reasons was that sex work was a nuisance in communities. While in Amsterdam, I noted that the only signs up from residents in the district were directed towards unruly tourists who made too much noise at night, and similar signs were posted up around the city in different areas which were not famous for the sex industry. It appeared to me that the real problem in the area was tourism, something that I, as what was essentially still a tourist, had already grown sick of. The amount of people that I almost hit with my bike because they wouldn't get out of the goddamn way, that's another podcast. Regardless, what I wanted to point out was that a daycare for essentially infants and toddlers was not going to be influenced by the presence of sex work in the community. Do you remember being an infant and a toddler? Do you remember looking around and taking things in and deciding that that was inappropriate for you? Or as a toddler, did you suddenly decide that you were going to be a sex worker too because you saw a sex worker on the street? No! That's ridiculous! Is that not one of the most ridiculous ideas that you have ever heard? Relating back to myself, however, I wanted to point out that I have experienced some traumatic events when I was younger, the kind of things that many of these looky-loos appeared to be worried about. When I was 13, I was assaulted by somebody I thought was a friend of mine, who took advantage of me. I was also introduced to a teacher who ended up grooming me for 5 years before he was eventually fired for inappropriate conduct with another student. These incidents did not come from me seeing a woman with a big butt on a billboard in town. They happened because somebody close to me abused the trust that I had put into them. If you are so worried about the impact of, quote, poor morals on your children, try looking towards the people that they are actually interacting with. Most predators are people that your children know and have been taught to trust. It's the same principle that keeps misinformation of sex trafficking prolific. Trafficking doesn't occur because the sex industry is decriminalized. It happens because abusive individuals take advantage of people's vulnerabilities and their trust. Stigma is just as prolific to the clients of the sex industry as it is to the people who work in it. As Dr. Wotton points out, legislation like the Swedish model doesn't just harm sex workers, it targets clients of sex workers as well. Sex is not a dirty thing that should be scorned or hidden. It is a beautiful act that everybody deserves safe access to. Dr. Wotton points out that people with disabilities often turn to the sex industry as a way to comfortably explore their sexuality and to experience the release that most of us take for granted. Sex can be as simple as chasing a good feeling and hopefully an orgasm, and it can also be a beautifully healing experience. Regardless, it doesn't make any sense to deny anyone that kind of opportunity. I know, as somebody who technically has a hidden disability and who struggles with certain situations thanks to my CPTSD, that it can be difficult to find the kind of safety and support that she describes in her work. I asked the rest of the people that I interviewed about what some of the barriers to safety they experienced were, and some of the misconceptions they have faced about the sex industry are. Some of the other points that were raised ran in the same vein that there was a distinct lack of respect for the industry. Annie, in Canada, spoke about it.
Honestly, it's the same one that I faced when I started dancing. It's that society thinks that we are one thing that we're not. I am old now. I'm old enough now at 51 that I've met a lot of people who work in a lot of different industries, come from so many different backgrounds, and there's never been a group of people that I have met who are more competent, intelligent, compassionate, empowered. Like, there's just no other, like, they think we're these exploited, they think we're weak. They think we're too stupid to know our own exploitation. They think we're weak and stupid and exploited. That they don't even know what they think, because they'll say we're victims, but then they'll handcuff us. So it's so much irony going on. And the truth is, I honestly have never met such intelligent people and such incredible people in any industry outside of this industry. The adult entertainment industry, it attracts the best people, the most incredible people, honestly. And they're fucking business people. They're entrepreneurs. So that's why I'm always confused that we have like such a socialism aspect to our industry, while we're all just such capitalists. But like, I don't know. It's just a really interesting, and I just think people don't know how competent we are. That's the biggest thing.
Yeah. Katie also echoed that sentiment.
But is there anything that you would want the general public to understand about sex work?
I guess it's quite tricky, because obviously every sex worker is going to say something different. But it's a job. It's a job, my dudes. It's that whole like thing of like sex work is real work. I clock in for my 9 to 5 or whatever it is. I put my work clothes on, I put on my work persona, my professional persona, and I go to work. And there are different motivations for every person to go and do the job that they choose to do. So there are different, like, I guess with any job, there is value and motivation to do that job. And for sex work especially, sometimes there's no motivation. It's the 9 to 5 and my kid goes to school around the corner. It's accessible to me. So I think not assuming someone's motivation to be in the industry, because it could just be a job. So I don't know, like maybe simplifying the fact that sex workers is just a job for people, and the motivations or passion for it come from so many different places, and that there can be no assumed motivation for it, I guess.
I couldn't have said it better myself. I decided to make this episode a little bit shorter than the others, because I wanted to reel myself in a little bit and stop myself from creating a series that only focused on the negative aspects of the industry. Unfortunately, with all of the variations of legislation and the plethora of stigma in the world, it is easy to get lost in the discussions of the negative. I know that it drains me to look at the news every day here in the States and read about another piece of false information being peddled, or another law that is being marketed as a win for anti-sex trafficking, when in reality is a crushing blow. Listening to people in a courtroom scream profanities about the industry and trying to shut down a bill that would save lives, or trying to patiently explain to strangers in Miami why calling an Uber wasn't going to lead them into being sex trafficked, is tiring. My once favorite show, Law & Order SVU, has in many ways been ruined. My heart rate elevates when I listen to people in a college class talk about how the red light district is going to traumatize children. Part of listening is realizing how few people are joining you. I sincerely hope that I have taught some people new things in this podcast, but I also wanted to take some space and remind everyone, including myself, what is so wonderful about this community. I joined pole dancing and met people from the industry at a time in my life that I was so deeply and genuinely broken and hurting, and listening to stunning human beings tell me that sex doesn't have to look the way I saw it, snarling, scary, and dangerous, changed my perspective on myself. The pole and the stripper community built up my confidence. It made, and still makes me, deliriously happy. Some of the few times that I feel myself healing and feel myself not be afraid is when I'm dancing in my 9-inch heels. Listening to people like Dr. Wotton speak about how sex work enables people to find joy and connection has made me hopeful to find my own healing journey. Listening to Katie speak so glowingly about the difference that sex work made in her life fills me with joy. Sex workers are some of the most confident, kindest, courageous people that I have ever had the joy to connect to. Look just to Alex and Bella, who dedicated their lives to helping out members of the community, or Annie, who found joy and new life in her work. It is so easy to get bogged down in some of the unfair, scary parts of the industry. I launched this podcast hoping to highlight the narratives of sex workers. The narratives are these. Sex work is one of the oldest occupations, and it is also one of the most beautiful and diverse, and yet it is still one of the most misunderstood. Sex work is a job, a space to heal, a space to be authentic and unafraid. It is a space that provides comfort to many, and that forges strong bonds between incredible individuals. It faces so much criticism and misinformation and so many attempts to stamp it out, and yet it is still thriving. Listening to the people of this industry should not only be the only way to inform legislation around the world, but it should be the first place to get that information. Decriminalizing sex work protects people and provides space for vulnerability to flourish and be explored and accepted. Sex workers are people. Clients are people. We should all be finding joy in sex and in our vulnerabilities. We should all be opening up to trying new things. To close this series, I have compiled a few of my favorite anecdotes collected from the people that I spoke to. I hope you finish listening knowing something new about the industry, because you can trust that I absolutely learned so many new things while I was making this podcast. Thank you.
I always get asked I always get asked, tell me about the first client with a disability that you ever saw. And I'm like, I don't know really, because invisible or dynamic disabilities, you wouldn't know unless the client told you. But the example I often give is not the one that people are expecting, but it's the one that I always remember in my mind. And it was a guy who had to have a medical circumcision later in life. So he had an uncut penis. He hadn't been circumcised, and there had been a medical thing that had occurred, and the best thing moving forward was for him to be circumcised. And so he was between girlfriends, and he found me in a massage parlor, and he had the operation, but he thought about it, and he really wanted to do a slow and steady resensitization series of sessions. So he saw me a number of times, and he wanted to start dating, but he thought that he would be too anxious about if he got aroused or if he would be able to take on any touch without kind of hitting the wall, hitting the roof. So I saw him for a series of sessions so that his body and his mind and his penis were able to start feeling good and be able to receive touch until he felt confident enough to then start dating. And I thought that was really great. And I really applaud a lot of clients who come to see sex workers, because they've had to jump through a lot of hoops just to see us, but they've also had to really contemplate crossing that invisible societal line that society has placed on, you know, what a good man is and what a bad man is, looking at it like heterosexually or not. But it's often clients have to think about it and really go, no, this is actually really beneficial to me. Like, this is really what I need. And I often talk to my clients about, like, I think it's really good, like, you've acknowledged what you need, what your body needs. Sometimes it is about just having that sensual touch and someone nice to talk to and debrief with or celebrate something with. All of this, you know, once again from my professional experience, but also came out in my PhD research, which you'll be able to read soon.
Love working privately. So I work from a house that is, I think, either owned or rented by a retired worker. And she decked out the house. It's beautiful and hires out the room to workers, which means this timing and the schedule's super flexible. So I do tour as often as I can, which is where I can get a good financial boost, which means I love sex work. So I don't want to have to work to get by. So I like to tour and get a big, like, not, you know, I'm not a millionaire, but I like to get a good chunk of money so that if I don't have to work because of my autoimmune disease or like I'm just not feeling up to it, then I don't have to. So I'm quite privileged in that sense that touring means that I can put some money away so that I don't have to work day to day in Christchurch if I don't feel like it.
Like I said, I love pole dancing. I love stripping. So
Oh yeah.
I'm interested to hear, you know, what really connected you to it.
For me, it was definitely the power of performing. Just that power that you feel when you're on stage and you're really into your show, and then the creativity of it and being able to, you know, plan your whole show, your music, your costumes, your shoes, everything. And I'd always been a tomboy. So stripping was the first time I was ever feminine or tried to, like, you know, embrace whatever femininity I really had. Like, I didn't wear much makeup. I didn't wear heels, like none of that. Like all of that I had to learn when I started stripping. And it was just such an adventure, you know?
Absolutely.
How about you? What was yours? You said the pole dancing, was that specifically it?
So I started pole dancing when I was 16, that was like, I wasn't stripping, but I was started getting on the pole with the local studio. And it was literally the first time I went, I was like, this is like the best thing. I was surrounded by so many like confident, strong, like beautiful women. A lot of them were like sex workers as well. And it was just like the most like accepted I had felt. And like the power of being able to like use my body. I was very shy, you know, as a teenager. And I, you know, I had like a lot of like, you know, tough experiences and stuff like that. And then going and being able to like just like you said, like perform and tap into like my own like sense of like I am so like I am strong. I have this connection to my body. Like people are appreciating it. It was really like one of the most beautiful experiences. I said this last time, but I'm obsessed with the fact that we both like got into this.
How did
Like
we get here?
absolutely insane. I was
That's
looking
so
back
fun.
at like the photos from when you did me up as a pinup doll when I had my horrible haircut. And it was like,
so
oh, shit.
cute.
That was not cute. That was the most Karen I've ever looked in my entire life.
But you didn't act like a Karen, which makes it. We were babies. We had no idea what was coming. We're just so iconic because I think 3 years after that, where I was cosplaying as a 1950s housewife,
Yeah.
I was my puss out for sale. Iconic. Iconic.
I think literally like 2 months after that was when I started pole dancing.
That's amazing. Oh my God, I cannot wait to catch up. This is going to be so good.
And yeah, I mentioned I have 3 children. They're wonderful. 2 are adults and 1 is in high school. And they are wonderful. They love me. They accept me. They don't make me feel bad about my work. And I think a lot of the reason why we're so close is the time I've had with them over the last 7 years. And also because of the struggle that we all went through as a family with my health issues. And I think when you go through stuff like that, you start to realize that a lot of other stuff is really meaningless. It doesn't matter. And what matters is this person I love who's doing the best they can,
Yeah.
you know, and my kids have just always really appreciated me. Oh, I'm getting emotional.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Illuminated in Red Light. And a big, big thank you to all of my guests who participated on this episode of the show. If you have comments, questions, compliments, concerns that you would like to give me, please feel free to comment down below or message me at Illuminated in Red Light Pod on Instagram. My final thanks is to Professor Austin Jackson, who encouraged me to start this project and without whom I absolutely would never have completed this. Everything here is owed to you. And also to me. Thank you to me. And always remember, rights, not rescue. Hello, me again. Just chiming in with an important note about one of my guests, Dr. Rachel Wotton. Please note that while this recording was done in anticipation of Rachel's June conferral, due to human and system failure, this achievement was formally relayed to the government, and therefore her conferral will now occur on the 20th of August 2025. Rachel's work and her website has been linked into the show notes below. I highly encourage you to go and check that out now. Bye!